Sarah Donovan looked at her reflection in the spotless bathroom mirror of her Manhattan penthouse. Her face, illuminated by the cold white light, seemed foreign. Deep shadows under her eyes betrayed sleepless nights, and thin lines around her lips reminded her of years of suppressing emotions she never allowed herself to show. This morning, the mirror reflected not only her face, but also the cracks she could no longer ignore. She barely recognized herself in this woman. A successful lawyer who had it all. A prestigious career, a luxurious home, a husband envied by half her colleagues. But there was something that no one but her could see. A cold emptiness growing inside. Sarah took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. Her thoughts returned to the conversation she overheard the night before. It was accidental. A whisper in the hallway as she climbed the stairs to her office. "Did you know he went there again?" A woman's voice asked, full of surprise. A man replied quickly and quietly, but she caught the words. "Yes, with that blonde. She's with him everywhere now." Those words stuck in her mind like a thorn and hadn't let go since. Sarah knew who they were talking about Michael, about her husband. All day, she tried to convince herself it was a misunderstanding, that she was working too much and imagining problems. But something in her heart told her it wasn't so. Michael had always been the embodiment of the perfect partner. He said the right words, made the right gestures. But behind those perfect facades, as she now realized, there was something more. Something dark. Sarah sat at the kitchen island and looked at the cup of cold coffee in front of her. This moment should have been an ordinary morning as she prepared for another workday. But instead, it became a moment of realization that her life would never be the same. She remembered how Michael had explained his trip to Chicago just a week ago. His confident voice and casual smile. "It's just for a couple of days, honey. Clients demand my presence, and I can't refuse." She believed him. Or pretended to believe because it was easier not to doubt. She believed him despite the barely perceptible tremor in his voice that she had never noticed before. The phone on the kitchen counter vibrated, pulling her out of her memories. Sarah picked it up and saw a notification from Instagram. She wouldn't have paid attention to it if it weren't for the name that appeared on the screen. Kara Watson. Kara was one of those women Sarah instinctively avoided. Beautiful, ambitious, always smiling in photos with perfectly styled hair and the caption, "Living life to the fullest." Sarah opened the app, her fingers trembling. In the photo, Kara was dressed in a dress Sarah had seen in the window of a boutique she and Michael had visited a few months ago. The background of the photo was a hotel room. The very room at the Ritz-Carlton where Michael had stayed on his trip to Chicago. The caption under the photo read like a mockery. "Perfect weekend with the best company." Sarah felt her breath quicken. She couldn't move, couldn't look away from the screen. This photo was confirmation of her worst fears. The world she had built began to crack like thin glass under pressure. All day, Sarah felt like she was in a fog. She did her work automatically, her face remaining calm and composed, but inside, everything was boiling. She couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts kept returning to the same question. How long had this been going on? When did Michael start lying? And what else was he hiding from her? Later that evening, sitting in the darkness of her living room, she allowed herself to feel for the first time. Pain, anger, fear. It all rushed in at once. She looked at their wedding photo standing on a shelf. How long had she been deceived? How long had she closed her eyes to the obvious signs? Sarah didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She couldn't be a victim anymore. She got up from the couch, took her phone, and began searching for a number she had saved a few years ago. It was the number of a private detective agency that had once helped her with a complex corporate fraud case. Now she was going to use their help to uncover the truth in her own life. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and professional. "Blackstone Private Investigation Agency. How can we help you?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I need your help. It's a personal matter." Sarah woke up the next morning with a heaviness in her chest, as if all night her heart had been beating with anxiety. She lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the awakening city outside the window. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, and her thoughts swirled around the words she had spoken the night before. "I need your help. It's a personal matter." Her inner world was no longer the same. Everything that had once seemed solid had turned out to be shifting sand. Sarah felt that her world was about to collapse, but now she knew she had to find answers, no matter how painful the process. The day began with Sarah going to a meeting with a detective from the Blackstone Agency. The agency was located in an office building on the corner of Park Avenue, which from the outside seemed quite unremarkable. Inside, however, everything looked strict, almost official. Wooden furniture, subdued lighting, and shelves filled with files and documents. She was met by Detective Bennett, a man in his 50s with a penetrating gaze and a touch of gray at his temples. His calmness and professionalism were reassuring. When they sat down at his desk, Sarah placed her phone on it and showed him the photo that had been haunting her. "This is my husband, and as I suspect, his mistress," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. "I want to know everything: where he was, who he was with, how long this has been going on. And," she hesitated, then firmly added, "what else he is hiding from me." Bennett nodded, taking notes in a notebook. His gaze lingered on her face for a moment, studying her reaction. "Are you sure you want to know the whole truth, Mrs. Donovan? Sometimes the answers can be harder than you expect." Sarah met his gaze. "I can't live in ignorance anymore. I need the truth." The investigation began faster than Sarah expected. That same day, detectives began checking records of Michael's trips, his bank transactions, phone calls, and even messages on social media. In the evening, when Sarah returned home, she was met with emptiness. Michael was not there. On the table in the hallway lay a note. "Coming home late, meeting with a client." Before, she wouldn't have even noticed this, but now every detail seemed suspicious. Sarah sat on the couch, staring at the soft light of the lamp. Her gaze accidentally fell on a photo standing on a bookshelf. It was their wedding photo. Michael looked at her with adoration, and she smiled, unaware that 5 years later their marriage would turn into a cold farce. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of the phone. It was Bennett. "Mrs. Donovan, we have the first results," he reported. "You'd better come to the office." In Bennett's office, it was quiet when Sarah sat across from him. The detective laid out several photos and documents on the table. "Your husband was not in Chicago last week, as he claimed," he began. "He stayed at the Ritz-Carlton here in New York. We have surveillance camera footage and receipts from the hotel restaurant." He pushed the photos toward Sarah. In one of them, Michael stood in the hotel lobby next to the same woman from the Instagram photo. Sarah felt her heart tighten. It was one thing to suspect, and quite another to see the evidence with her own eyes. "And that's not all," Bennett continued. "We checked his phone calls and messages. He has been communicating with this woman for at least 6 months. In the conversations, they mentioned meetings, expensive gifts, and plans for the future." Sarah felt everything inside her freeze. She clenched her fists, trying to maintain her composure. "This is still not the end, Mrs. Donovan. We are digging deeper. I believe your husband may have other secrets." Sarah nodded, trying to suppress the emotions that overwhelmed her. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. Continue." When Sarah returned home, the apartment was quiet. Michael had not yet arrived, but she no longer cared. She stood by the window, looking at the night city, and thought about how she could have been so blind. Michael, the man she trusted most, had betrayed her. And this betrayal had been going on for many months, if not years. But in her soul, instead of pain, a new emotion began to awaken: determination. She would no longer be someone who could be deceived. Her life was ruined, but now she knew what to do. Sarah understood that this was only the beginning, and more revelations awaited her. She looked at her reflection in the window glass. This was not the woman who would allow herself to be broken. She was ready to learn the whole truth. Sarah woke up early in the morning, her eyes not yet accustomed to the gray light filtering through the thick curtains of the bedroom. She felt tired, as if instead of sleep, she had been carrying a heavy burden on her shoulders all night. Her phone, lying on the bedside table, vibrated. It was a new report from Bennett. The message was brief. "There is new information. Come urgently." Her heart quickened. She knew this was not just details about Michael, but something more. But what exactly, she could not imagine. An hour later, she was already sitting in the detective's office. Bennett looked serious, his usually calm gaze more tense. "Mrs. Donovan, I hope you are ready for what you are about to hear," he began. "The deeper we dig, the more puzzles surface. I have several important details you need to know." He spread out photos and documents in front of her. In one of the photos, Michael stood in an expensive restaurant, his hand on the back of the same woman from the photo. They smiled as if they were in their own world. "Her name is Allison Grace," Bennett said. "She works as a lawyer in a large firm and seems to have not only personal but also business relationships with your husband. We have data indicating that she helped him with some financial matters." "Financial matters?" Sarah frowned. "Which ones exactly?" Bennett pulled out another document and handed it to her. "We checked Michael's bank transactions. Over the past 6 months, several large sums have been withdrawn from your joint account. These funds, as we found out, he transferred to her personal account. There were also noticeable regular expenses on hotels, restaurants, and even expensive jewelry." Sarah clenched the document in her hands, feeling anger begin to rise. Michael had not only betrayed her, he had used their joint funds to finance his new life. "That's not all," Bennett continued, pulling out another sheet. "We gained access to his emails. There are mentions of buying real estate. It seems he is planning to move in with Allison to a new home." Sarah felt her blood boil. This was like a punch in the gut. He was not just lying to her. He was building a new life behind her back, as if their marriage had never existed. When Sarah returned home, the apartment seemed eerily quiet. On the kitchen table lay a note from Michael. "Coming home late. Don't wait for me." Her gaze stopped on the note, and she felt a wave of anger rise within her. She went to the cabinet where the documents were kept and began searching for their financial reports. Each time she found confirmation of what Bennett had said, her anger intensified. These were checks for large amounts made out to companies she had never heard of, statements with expenses on items she had never seen in their home. But the most painful was the document confirming the purchase of a house. It was not just a house. It was a luxurious estate in the suburbs. The names of the buyers: Michael Donovan and Allison Grace. The next day, Sarah met with Bennett again, this time more determined than ever. "I want to know everything about her," she declared. "Who she is, where she came from, and how long they have been together." Bennett nodded and handed her a dossier. Allison Grace was born in Chicago, graduated from Harvard, and now works in a law firm specializing in corporate disputes. We also found out that she has had dealings with your husband on several occasions. Their affair, it seems, began about a year ago. Sarah sat, looking at Allison's photo. Young, confident, with a flawless smile. Someone many would consider the perfect partner. But Sarah didn't care. She was more concerned with another question. "And what do I do now?" she asked, looking at Bennett. "We can gather more evidence if you want to hold him accountable," he suggested. "But the most important thing is, you need to decide what you want. Divorce, compensation, public exposure?" Sarah pondered. She didn't know if she was ready for the battle that would accompany each of these steps. But one thing she knew for sure: she would no longer allow Michael to control her life. That evening, sitting at home, Sarah felt a strange relief. The truth, no matter how painful, had given her strength. She was no longer the woman who closed her eyes to troubling signs. Now she was ready to fight for herself. Looking in the mirror, she saw her reflection, and for the first time in a long time, did not feel broken. In her eyes, there was a gleam of determination that had not been there before. This was not just pain. It was the beginning of something new. Sarah sat in her corner office, surrounded by silence broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. On her desk lay a photo of her and Michael embracing on the shore during their honeymoon. Once, this photo symbolized their love, but now it was just a reminder of the lie that had shattered her life. There was a knock at the door. It was her colleague, Rachel. "Sarah, are you okay?" she asked cautiously. "You look like you haven't slept all night." Sarah smiled tightly. "I'm fine, thanks," she replied, brushing off the concern. "Just a lot of work." But it wasn't work. It was the investigation she was conducting with Bennett. Over the past few weeks, her world had been turned upside down, and now she had to find a way to put her life back together. That same evening, Sarah was sitting at home when her phone vibrated. It was a message from Bennett. "We found something you need to see. Can you come to the office?" Her heart skipped a beat. She knew this would be an important moment. The meeting was scheduled for late in the evening, which only added to the tension. Sarah quickly got ready and headed to the detective agency's office. When she entered Bennett's office, he looked more serious than ever. "Have a seat, Mrs. Donovan," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "I think you need to know that this is not just personal betrayal. It seems your husband is involved in something much more serious." He laid out printouts of emails, bank statements, and photos in front of her. "We discovered that Michael is linked to a major money laundering scheme. These transactions through your joint accounts were part of a larger operation, and Allison seems to play a key role in this." Sarah felt her palms sweat. She took the documents, scanning the lines of text. Words like shell companies, illegal transfers, and corruption flashed before her eyes. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Absolutely," Bennett replied. "We have evidence that will prove this in court. The question is, what do you want to do next?" Sarah fell silent, trying to process what she had heard. This was more than she could have imagined. Michael's betrayal was no longer just personal pain. It was now something dangerous, something that could ruin her life if she wasn't careful. The next day, Sarah returned home early. She opened the door to their bedroom and began rummaging through Michael's things. She knew what she was looking for, something that would confirm his involvement. After a few minutes, she found a leather briefcase hidden in the closet. Inside were documents, contracts, checks, photos. All of them pointed to Michael's involvement in fraudulent schemes. She sat on the floor, surrounded by papers, when she heard the front door slam. It was Michael. "Sarah, are you home?" His voice echoed through the apartment. Her heart raced. She quickly hid the documents and went out into the hallway, trying to look calm. "Yes, I'm here," she said, meeting his gaze. He looked tired, but still as confident as ever. "You look tense," he noticed, approaching her. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, just a tough day," she replied, trying to hide her true emotions. But inside, everything was boiling. She knew she now had all the cards in her hands, but she had to play them carefully. She couldn't let Michael know that she knew. Late that night, when Michael was asleep, Sarah took her phone and called Bennett. "I found more evidence," she said. "We need to use this." "This is risky," he warned. "If he finds out that you know something, it could be dangerous." "I'm ready to take the risk," Sarah said firmly. "He has to be held accountable for everything." In the morning, Sarah sat at her desk, looking out the window at the waking city. She knew that ahead of her lay a battle, but for the first time in a long time, she felt strong. Michael's lies and attempts to control her no longer frightened her. She was ready for what was to come. If he thought he could hide the truth, he was sorely mistaken, she thought, looking at her reflection in the glass. Her eyes sparkled with determination. Sarah knew that the decisive moment had come. Over the past weeks, she had patiently gathered evidence, studied every move Michael and his accomplice, her former friend Allison, had made. Now she had enough evidence to bring their world crashing down. The question was only how and when to strike. She sat in her living room, leaning over a table strewn with printouts of bank transfers, phone call records, and photos. The detective Bennett had not let her down. He had obtained all the necessary evidence. Now she had to decide how to deliver the blow. Her phone vibrated. A message from Bennett. "We're ready. The decision is yours." Sarah took a deep breath and typed a response. "Meet in an hour." She approached the mirror in her bedroom and looked at her reflection. Just a few months ago, she had been a different woman. A loving wife, a loyal friend. Now, a completely different version of herself stood before her. Strong, ready for battle. Her eyes no longer shone with trust, and her lips were pressed into a determined line. She ran her fingers over the surface of the dresser and stopped at a small box. Inside lay her wedding ring, a symbol of love that had long since died. Sarah clenched it in her hand, feeling the cold metal. "Did you think I would always be yours?" she thought, her mind racing with the pain of memories. She put the ring back in the box and wiped away tears. There was no time for emotions now. Today, everything had to change. Bennett's office was located in an old building with peeling brickwork and narrow corridors filled with the scent of paper and coffee. Sarah stepped inside, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor. The detective was waiting for her behind a massive oak desk with documents that could ruin Michael's life laid out before him. "Are you sure?" he asked, looking up at her with a serious expression. Sarah nodded. "We've taken this as far as we can. Now it's time to show him he's not invincible." Bennett pulled several envelopes from a folder. "We have two options. We hand the materials over to the police and they start an official investigation. It will be a long process, but justice will prevail. Or," he paused, giving her a chance to finish the thought herself. "Or I handle it personally." Sarah completed his sentence. The detective slowly nodded. "Exactly. You have the opportunity to strike before he realizes what's happening." Sarah took the envelopes in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'll take care of it." Sarah knew that Michael would never suspect her. He thought of her as weak, naive, incapable of acting decisively. She arranged a meeting at their favorite restaurant where they used to celebrate anniversaries. Michael arrived in good spirits, dressed in an expensive suit and with a smug smile. He didn't even notice the absence of love in her eyes. "You look amazing," he said, kissing her on the cheek. Sarah smiled, hiding her anger behind a mask of indifference. "Thanks. We need to talk." Michael sat down, ordering their usual wine. "I'm always happy to talk, dear." Sarah watched as he filled the glasses and felt a wave of disgust. "I know about you and Allison." Michael froze. He looked up at her but quickly regained his composure, feigning innocent surprise. "What are you talking about?" "About your little scheme. About how you used me, about the conversations, the expensive gifts, and the plans for the future." She pulled out an envelope and tossed it onto the table. Michael paled. He opened it, flipped through the pages, and straightened in his chair. "Where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter. The question is, what are you going to do now?" Michael was silent for a few seconds, then smirked. "You can't prove anything. And if you try, you have no idea who you're dealing with." Sarah met his gaze. "You're right. I can't do it alone." She slowly pulled out her phone and played a recording of their conversation. Michael's voice echoed through the room. "We covered our tracks. Everything went through offshores. No one will know. Not even Sarah." Michael clenched his fists. "You're playing a dangerous game." Sarah leaned forward, her voice cold as steel. "You've lost, Michael. I filed for divorce. All the evidence has been handed over to the right people. Tomorrow you'll be in the news. And Allison, well, she'll have to answer for her actions too." His face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this." Sarah stood up, straightening her dress. "No, Michael. You will." She turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving him alone amidst the scattered papers and shattered illusions. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the vibration of her phone. "It's Bennett," came the voice on the other end. "Your plan worked. Michael has been arrested." She smiled, feeling a sense of freedom for the first time in months. But this was only the first battle. She knew her ex-husband wouldn't give up so easily, and if he thought this was the end, he was mistaken. Sarah sat in her living room, surrounded by semi-darkness. The only source of light was the soft glow of a table lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. On the table in front of her lay the remnants of her past life: wedding photos, bank statements, detective reports. Everything that had once connected her to Michael now seemed foreign, tainted, unnecessary. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the table and took a deep breath. Tomorrow was supposed to be the end of it all. Tomorrow, her ex-husband would be sitting in court, and his face would be splashed across the front pages of newspapers. But that wasn't enough. She felt that it wasn't enough. Sarah put on a dark coat and tied her hair back into a tight bun. Her hands were steady. There was no fear, no doubt. She descended the stairs, crossed the street, and got into a taxi. "The Plaza Hotel, please." The driver silently nodded. When the car stopped in front of the hotel entrance, Sarah got out, pulled up the collar of her coat, and walked inside. The lobby was luxurious, filled with expensive scents and hushed conversations. She immediately spotted him. He was sitting at the bar, clutching a glass of whiskey in his hands. His tie was loosened, his face tired, but his eyes still held a glint of self-assurance. She approached him. "Didn't expect to see me?" Michael looked up, his expression darkening. What do you want, Sarah?" "To talk. One last time." He sighed, took a sip of his whiskey, and nodded. "Fine, let's talk." She sat down across from him, carefully observing his expression. "Did you ever regret it? Did you ever think about what you destroyed?" He smirked, shaking his head. "You don't understand, Sarah. This isn't about regret, it's about survival. You were just a stepping stone. You were convenient. I thought you knew that." She felt something inside her snap. Was I really that blind, Michael? That naive? He shrugged. "You always wanted to believe in the best." She leaned in closer. "And do you believe in fate, Michael?" He frowned. "What kind of stupid question is that?" "Just think about it. Sometimes fate gives you a chance to make amends. And sometimes it takes everything away from you." She stood up. "Goodbye, Michael." She walked away, leaving him sitting in the dimly lit bar, unaware of what lay ahead. Sarah returned home, took off her coat, and turned on the TV. The channels were already covering the next day's court proceedings. Prominent financier Michael Hunter accused of fraud, money laundering, and betraying his wife. She turned off the screen. A few hours later, she learned that he had been found dead in his hotel room. The news buzzed about it all night. Theories changed one after another. Overdose, suicide, accident. But Sarah knew the truth. She sat in the dark room, sipping wine, and watched as her life finally began to free itself from his shadow. Tomorrow would be a new day. Tomorrow she would be free.